I wish to share with you the heartbreaking words and story of a mother whose daughter was ripped away from her. The midwife laid the baby on my chest. As I gazed down at her, I was overwhelmed by love so strong it took my breath away. I turned to my husband Saber and said, "Isn't she beautiful?" He just stared at her, remained silent. My heart sank. Now he had a daughter. He couldn't hide his disappointment. I chose the name Aisha, and I felt Saber would love her just as much once he got used to the idea. However, as the days passed, he hardly seemed to notice Aisha. He didn't cuddle her or change her nappies. When I spoke to him, he seemed distant and unsettled. I'd met Saber on a holiday in Egypt. We'd agreed we would live together in England. But when Aisha was 4 weeks old, he told me, "I'm going home to sort out some business." The weeks became months, and he didn't return. I sent photos in hopes that seeing Aisha would prompt him to come back, but it did not do any good. He missed Aisha's first smile, her first tooth, then her first steps, and her first words. When she was 18 months old, I booked a flight to Egypt. Aisha had the right to know her father, and I felt sure that once he saw her big brown eyes, he would melt. But the moment we landed, I realized I made a huge mistake. Saber was sulky, and he clearly didn't want us there. We had a big row, and he became violent. So as soon as I arrived home, I filed for a divorce. It was agreed that I would take Aisha to visit her father every year, and he would pay me maintenance for her. Saber was furious with me. It was a huge dishonor for his wife to divorce him, and he told me, "You have humiliated me." Saber never gave me a penny towards Aisha's upbringing, but to comply with my side of the divorce agreement, we visited him a few months later. Thankfully, he was polite and well-behaved. It went so well that a few months later, we returned to where Saber was staying for another visit. He behaved like a gentleman, and I'd hoped we put our troubles behind us. One afternoon, we were on our way home from a day out when he suggested stopping for a drink. We sat chatting over coffee when suddenly a car screeched to a halt at the door of the cafe, the engine revving loudly. Saber jumped to his feet, grabbed Aisha from her chair and ran. Before I could react, they were in the car and gone, leaving only a cloud of dust. I began to scream in horror. I ran to the nearest police station. "Please help," I begged. "My daughter has been abducted." I was sobbing and shaking, but the police officers didn't take it seriously at all. In desperation, I went to the British Embassy, and I called everyone I could think of. Aisha's face was etched in my mind. She looked so terrified as Saber ran off with her. She was 2 years old, hardly knew her father. I knew she'd be lost without me. That night, Saber called and said, "You broke my heart by bringing shame on my family, so I will break your heart." "Why take Aisha?" I said. "She has nothing to do with the divorce." "I took Aisha because she is your heart," he said. As the days turned into weeks, I was so distraught, I couldn't sleep or eat. Saber continued to call. He would tell me that Aisha was dead, or that he had lost her. Once even he said, "She never really existed. You imagined her being born." It was torture. A month after Aisha had been snatched, I was awarded custody in the Egyptian courts. But Saber refused to reveal where Aisha was. My local MP, Ivan Lewis, was wonderful. He flew out to Egypt to meet with the foreign minister there. The British police did all they could too. Finally, after 8 months, I received a call from the British Embassy. I sobbed with relief as a voice said, "Aisha has been found." I traveled to Cairo and went to court. Once the paperwork was checked, a court official led me to a room. We stepped inside and my eyes fell on a little figure. Aisha's eyes met mine, and for the moment she looked confused, but then her face breaking into a huge smile. She ran towards me and shouted, "Mommy!" Her clothes were filthy. She had had lice and a bladder and a kidney infection. I was horrified, but I was so relieved to have her back. It turned out she had been found at this dingy house miles away from where Saber lived. He had been paying a stranger to look after her. In the days that followed, every time the doorbell rang, she would scream and hide under the table. I had no ideas what horrors she suffered, and I just wanted to take her home. But I was ordered to stay in Egypt so that Saber could have access. He kept on filing court orders to keep me in the country. I had no money to fight him, and so I found myself trapped in Egypt. As I was unable to get a work permit, we relied on donations from friends in the UK. It wasn't easy, but all that mattered was that I had Aisha back. Over time, she turned into a bubbly, confident little girl, and I hoped that the memories of her ordeal were starting to fade. She saw Saber occasionally, but most of the time he didn't even turn up for the visits. When Aisha was 4 years old, a revolution broke out. Almost overnight, the country descended into total chaos. We were ducking bullets in the streets. There were gunmen in the foyer of our Cairo apartment. It was so frightening that I was desperate to leave. But Aisha was not allowed because of the court order. I kept begging the British government to help. Finally, my lawyers said we would soon be allowed to go home. I was so excited. A few months later, Saber saw Aisha for an agreed visit. Around the time he was supposed to bring her home, the phone rang. "I'm keeping her," he said, "and there's nothing you can do." Before I could absorb the words, he hung up. I felt sick with panic. Once was cruel enough, but twice seemed too much for any mother to take. Once again, I had to embark on the process of trying to get her back, but it was so much harder this time. Following the revolution, Egypt was in chaos. The police and the courts were in disarray. Even the lawyers were taking bribes. I realized I could trust no one. The village where Saber lived was a dangerous place, and I knew my life would be at risk if I went to try to get Aisha. After a month, Saber phoned. He said, "Aisha has stopped eating. Can you come see her?" At Saber's home, I threw my arms around Aisha. She was quiet and tearful and whispered to me in Arabic, "I want to come home." Her arms were covered in bruises and bite marks. I wasn't allowed to be alone with her in case I tried to snatch her. I had no choice but to leave again without my daughter. Soon after, Saber had changed his number and I didn't hear from him again. Recently, I had returned to my former home in the UK. I'm seeking help from the British government and the Foreign Office. So far, I haven't made any progress. I know I have to be patient, but it's hard. I haven't seen Aisha in almost 2 years. My heart continues to break without her. She is my reason for living, and I will never give up fighting for her.